So hi there. I've sort of gotten into a pattern of creating videos every 2 weeks. They take a lot of work. Doing them every week just started to be too much. This week seemed like a good one, a good time to do it, especially because we're not having not having classes on Tuesday. So here goes. I'm going to start out by reviewing something that I put in writing on English Connect, and then I'm going to do something a little different from usual. I'm going to talk about my own publications, the way I've used theory in my own research and writing. Because, as I mentioned, the ideas we're discussing this week around affect theory, and in particular Raymond Williams's term structure of feeling, are the ideas that I use most extensively in my own writing. So in thinking about this, I'm doing something we haven't done every week, showing how this theory is directly relevant to literary studies, and how theory, which isn't always explicitly literary theory, as you probably noticed, though it's all theory that has been used in the analysis of literature, how theory can be applied. So first, the review. The keyword affect, and what's called affect theory in general, challenges several different but related binary oppositions. One is the opposition between reason and emotion. Much theory, and much of common sense, puts those ideas in opposition to one another. In order to think rationally, it said, we must put aside our feelings and view things objectively, right? Affect is a term that implies that reason and emotion are not opposites. Everything we think is simply rational has some emotion behind it. At the same time, what we think of as merely emotional may well have a logic or rationality to it. Relatedly, affect is, as one writer put it, embodied thought. It deconstructs the long-standing philosophical distinction between mind and body. To quote Kvetkovich, who wrote the keyword article that we read, affect exists at, quote, the intersection of mind and body, cognition and sensation, and conscious and unconscious autonomic processes. Affect refers to things that happen inside the body, right? We don't control these things. They burst out. They're in our nerves, brains, or guts, as she puts it. And simultaneously things outside the body. They have to do with environments and transpersonal relations, her terms again. Thus, the term also puts into question binary oppositions between public and private, and between personal and political. Because affect, and now switching from review to moving forward, because affect puts all these oppositions into question, theorists come up with phrases that seem almost self-contradictory to talk about affect. Raymond Williams's phrase, structures of feeling, is one example of that apparent self-contradiction. According to common sense, and of course, if you've been paying attention in this course, you know that common sense is usually wrong, at least according to literary theory. According to common sense, feelings emanate spontaneously from individuals. They're the last things we would imagine are structured. But there's a whole school of thought that developed from that short chapter of Raymond Williams's that we read that shows that emotions have a history and that all the feelings we take to be simply natural have changed over time and thus are not simply natural. My own book, Public Sentiments, Structures of Feeling in 19th Century American Literature, not only took its subtitle from Williams's short chapter, it applies that idea to a bunch of different literary texts from the 19th century to show how American readers were trained to do something that we now take to be almost natural, something emotional. Starting in the 19th century, both authors of literature and writers about literature, really starting in the late 18th century, but anyway, authors of literature and writers about literature made an argument that what we should do when we encounter a character in a work of literature, or later a film or a TV show, any narrative, what we should do with a character is to identify with them sympathetically, or to use a word invented in the 20th century, empathetically. I'll come back to that. We were taught that we should both feel with characters, meaning feel the same things they do, especially when they're suffering. That's going to be important too. and that we should feel like those characters. Think of ourselves in comparison to them. We use them as role models, right? That's where that whole concept comes from. Now, there's tons of work out there, well beyond my own small contribution in my book, showing how the emotions or affects that we take for granted, including empathy, sympathy, feeling for others, that those are not just natural things, especially when it comes to our responses to literature and other kinds of texts. Before the 18th century, that kind of empathy was not considered the main response people had to literature. It was, to use a word we learned from Foucault, an implanted emotion. Now, it's important to note that the fact that such emotions are socially constructed, and that's going to be something that has been just shown over and over again. The fact that emotions are socially constructed does not mean that they are not real. Remember that same argument made about race. Social construction has real material effects. It shapes not just the material world, but the materiality of our brains, the way we feel. And the comparison between race and affect is not a coincidental one. There's a lot of scholarship out there about how racialized emotions are. I'm not going to talk about that a lot, but my book does have a detailed analysis of how the rhetoric of Black nationalism in the 1850s, yes, there was Black nationalism in the 1850s, and even Black nationalist fiction, and that analysis shows that Black thinkers understood emotions as racialized. But racialized doesn't just mean Black. I've also got a chapter of how Walt Whitman, in his early fiction, before he even started writing poetry, used affect as a way of imagining whiteness. On page 6 of her keyword essay on affect, Kvetkovich writes, this is a quote, "In the field of American studies, scholarship in categories such as sentimentality, sensationalism, sympathy, melodrama, and the Gothic has shown how cultural genres, especially fiction, produce social effects by mobilizing feeling." That's where my own work fits in. As she goes on, attention to affect is the culmination of several decades of feminist scholarship on clusters of related terms such as domesticity, family, and marriage, as well as on the historical continuities that link women's popular genres such as domestic and sentimental novels, theatrical melodrama, and women's film. 20 years or more of my research, including about 6 articles and 2 books, is covered in a couple of subordinate clauses of those 2 sentences. And they don't footnote me because there are so many people who are part of this research conversation covered in Kvetkovich's short paragraph. I could list probably 25 or 30 books that could be footnoted here, which is to say that keyword essays cover a lot of scholarly ground, and that scholarship tends to be very, very focused. In the next paragraph, Kvetkovich works very quickly through a series of examples. The way Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably the single novel most responsible for transforming the way Americans and others experienced and understood their emotions. I'll come back to this, but Uncle Tom's Cabin is by far the most influential book ever written by an American author. And if you don't study it sometime, you should. She talks about the way the escaped slave Harriet Jacobs's incidents in the life of a slave girl complicates and reworks the emotions that Stowe had sparked. And she talks about the way, more than a century later, Toni Morrison's Beloved returns to that historical moment to change the way we both feel and think about slavery and race now. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about, coming back to my own work. Public sentiments is part of that research conversation, as I said, and I signal my influences in that subtitle, Structures of Feeling in 19th Century American Literature. I trace both of the terms in that main title, public and sentiment, as keywords that change their meanings in the very time that I'm writing about. Sentiment is the one I want to focus on today. It's a complicated word. One way to describe sentiment is as a particular kind of affect, or maybe a particular range of affects. Think about how we use the term when we say public sentiment is shifting towards the Democrats or the Republicans. In that context, public sentiment means roughly the same as public opinion, right? But then the same TV reporter who describes this very general poll may interview a person on the street, right, who displays their individual private or personal feelings or opinions or views or sentiments about the Democrats or the Republicans. And that individual approach is also about sentiment. And through that interview, that individual sentiment becomes public. That's one way of thinking about sentiment. It's the most general way. But my book argues that sentimentality is a structure of feeling that emerged over the course of the 19th century, and ultimately that it's still a hegemonic structure of feeling in the United States today. And in that, just that one sentence, I'm kind of covering the entirety of the Raymond Williams excerpt that I had you read for this week. By saying that, I mean a few things. First, in the late 18th and early 19th century, people started thinking that the ability to share feelings was what defined the human being. This was a new idea. Not emotions themselves, of course, they weren't new. But the particular way of experiencing and defining emotions, and the way particular emotions defined who was fully human and who wasn't. And that's where emotions get racialized right from the start. Some of the earliest thinkers about race, about emotions, were also thinkers about race, and argued things like because you couldn't see a darker skinned person blush, they weren't really displaying their emotions properly, and therefore they were not fully human. Yes, that's a crazy argument, but that's the kind of argument that linked emotions and race, because emotions defined who was human. The person who wrote that was Thomas Jefferson, by the way. The crucial feeling, the one that mattered most, was the feeling that one could share emotionally in the suffering of others. The most important individual person in developing that theory, that theory of feeling, was Adam Smith. Yes, the same guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations, one of the foremost books in the history of capitalism. He wrote another book that was actually more influential in its time, called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And as you can tell from that title, Smith thought that some sentiments were more moral than others. The crucial sentiment, again, was the ability to feel the pain of others. He and others used the word sympathy to define this ability to feel the pain of others. And the word sympathy had a wider meaning than it does now, in part because the word empathy wasn't invented for another century or more. So sympathy had a range of meaning from pity, and pity kind of implies a hierarchy, right? You can't pity someone who's above you. But also empathy, which is more horizontal, right? You can empathize with anyone if they're feeling bad. At the same time that this way of thinking about feeling was emerging and becoming popular, another thing that was becoming popular was novels. Novels weren't the main kind of literature before the late 18th century. There were no novels published in the United States before the 1780s, in the 200 years or so of its existence. Though thousands and thousands of books were published, there was a lot of printing, novels weren't a thing. By the 1840s, so within just 50 years or so, novels made up a huge portion of publishing, maybe the majority. So the rise of the novel in the United States goes along with the rise of the idea of sympathy. Novels told the stories over and over again of people going through difficulties and suffering, and readers, of course, weren't supposed to laugh at that suffering or feel superior to it, or even learn moral lessons from it. Right? The main point of novels was rarely don't act like that person and you won't suffer like that person. Those are all ways of relating to suffering other than sympathy. Instead, over the course of the history of the novel, readers were increasingly asked to feel with the suffering of those characters. And the book's made very clear that if you didn't feel these characters' pain, that meant you were morally deficient. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin made this explicit. This is a novel that was 600 pages of enslaved Black people suffering horrific abuses, but also of white people feeling sympathy for those slaves And also, really importantly, repeated demonstrations that both enslaved Black people and free Black people were capable of feeling that sympathy too. In other words, it was 600 pages of proving that Black people were fully human, because humanity was defined as the ability to sympathize. At the end, Stowe tells the reader how to feel about what they've just read. What can an individual do? She asks rhetorically, and she immediately answers. They can see to it that they feel right. No, she doesn't say go participate in the Underground Railroad. She doesn't say become an abolitionist. She doesn't say lobby your congressperson, anything like that. She says feel right. This is a pure politics of affect. Stowe really believed that if she could change the feelings of enough people, slavery would fade away. There's a sense, only a sense, but there's a sense in which she was right, or at least that other people came to think she was right, and that's important. Readers testified by the millions that she had made them feel differently about slavery. When she met Abraham Lincoln in the White House during the middle of the Civil War, he apparently said to her, "So you're the little lady who started this great big war." That's a lot of power to attribute to a woman who wrote a work of fiction and who didn't claim even to want to change legislation, let alone start a war. All she claimed was to change people's feelings. Her politics were a politics of affect. And I'm not just saying that these ideas about sympathy defining humanity were in the air, though they were. There's concrete evidence of influential authors reading this stuff and putting it into practice. For instance, Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, two writers usually seen as very different from one another, were actually neighbors in Hartford, Connecticut, and they formed a reading group where they sat down and read carefully together Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments. These ideas were in authors' minds, they read them, and they put them into practice in their fiction. So as I said, Uncle Tom's Cabin was probably the best-selling book of the 19th century, maybe of all time. Its influence was global. It was translated into many languages within a year of its coming out. There were plays based on the novel that were the most popular plays well into the 20th century. And there were at least 10 film versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin even before sound cinema got invented. It's a hugely influential book. Now, my point is not to tout the importance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. The legacy of that book is very, very mixed. At the same time that it was powerfully anti-slavery, it was powerfully racist. It put into popular culture a set of stereotypes that persist to this day. To study it is to study the contradictions of this novel. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a great example of the politics of affect. It's also the central piece of evidence that from the mid-19th century on, the United States was transformed emotionally. Uncle Tom's Cabin and dozens of books like it inaugurated a new structure of feeling in the United States. The US became, and in many ways still is, a sentimental culture. What I mean by that is that sentimentalism, again, the structure of feeling in which the ability to sympathize or empathize with others is what defines who counts as human and who does not. Sentimentalism became widespread, became hegemonic, became common sense. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't contested, that nobody challenges it. Just recent examples, there was a thought-provoking article a couple of years ago about the Trump administration's policy towards child migrants titled, "The Cruelty is the Point," arguing that Trump's popularity has to do with a challenge to that dominant structure of feeling, and that we're becoming a culture in which sympathy is no longer the dominant way of defining humanity. There are also long been arguments against sentimentalism from the left, saying that defining humanity through sympathy is ultimately dehumanizing, and always has been. These are complicated arguments I'm not going to try to go over in a 25-minute video. But sentimentalism is a structure of feeling in two related ways. Feelings are structured socially, or socially constructed. And we are taught unconsciously to feel certain ways and to interpret that affect in a particular way. And those feelings structure our society. They organize who gets treated as fully human and who doesn't, who gets resources and who doesn't, who is a disposable human and who is not, and so on. The emotions matter in material ways. Now, I want to leave it there because I've already gone on longer than the 15 minutes I really hoped for here. What I've done here, though, just to review, is provided a very rudimentary outline of some of the theoretical premises of some of my own work, which is not to tout myself. I haven't assigned it after all, but to serve as an example of how a theory of affect can work in literary and cultural analysis. I, of course, could say much more, and I have, in the course of books, but rather than go into depth about that, I mean this example to allow you to turn back to the readings for this week, in particular the Raymond Williams, which I didn't post a question about, and to think more carefully about how sentiment functions, both personally and politically, how emotions work in the body and in the mind, how certain sentiments could create a structure of feeling, and in general about what Kvekovich calls the politics of affect. If you ask those questions about anything, including in your responses to the prompts for today, you're doing affect theory, and that's the goal of this week. Okay, see you on Friday, and stay safe this week.